Start just about on time then. So good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our discussion of Dr. Jeffrey Schneider's book, Uniform Fantasies, Soldiers, Sex, and Queer Emancipation in Imperial Germany, and it's published in 2023 with University of Toronto Press. I'm Professor Chad Gibbs of the Zucker Goldberg Center for Holocaust Studies at the College of Charleston, and I'm just going to be serving as chair and doing some introductions for our book talk today. Please be aware that the event is being recorded and it'll eventually end up on the Mosse Program's YouTube page. So first, I'd like to acknowledge the staff and supporters of the organizations that is underwriting today's event. This new book event is made possible by the History Department, the Center for European Studies, and the George L. Mosse Program in History, as well as the Mosse Lectures program at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, as well as the Zucker Goldberg Center for Holocaust Studies here at the College of Charleston. We thank them all for bringing us together today. So Jeffrey's discussion of his book will be followed today by comments from Professor Erwin Malakai. Erwin Malakai is Associate Professor of German Studies at the University of British Columbia. His research focuses on the intersection of queer studies and German cultural histories. Erwin's first book on Richard Oswald's iconic queer melodrama, Anders als die Andern, appeared with McGill Queen's University Press in 2023. His contribution to the advancement of international German studies, for his contribution to the German studies, he was awarded the Jakob, and Wilhelm Grimm Prize in the junior category from the German Federal Office and the German Academic Exchange Service. His research is currently supported by grants from the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, the Canada Council for the Arts, and the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation. Today's speaker is Dr. Jeffrey Schneider, and he is Professor of German Studies at Vassar College, where he currently serves as director of the Global 19th Century Studies Program and faculty director for institutional equity. He is, in addition to his book, Uniform Fantasies and related articles, he's co-written several articles on language pedagogy with his colleague Silke van der Emde. His work has appeared in edited volumes as well as in a variety of journals, including Central European History, German Studies Review, German Quarterly, and Literature and History. Today, Jeffrey's going to provide us with a discussion of his book, followed by a comment from Erwin, and then a Q&A from the audience. And at any time that you want in the audience, you can put those questions into the chat, and I will facilitate at the end by reading those questions out for our event. So without any more delay, I turn it over to Dr. Schneider.
So thanks so much, Chad, for introducing me and for moderating today. And I also want to express my gratitude to the Zucker Goldberg Center for Holocaust Studies at the College of Charleston and Skye Dunny at the George L. Mosse Program in History at the University of Wisconsin-Madison for inviting me today. Many thanks in advance to Erwin for offering his comments on my talk and book. I know I'll learn a lot from what he has to say. And of course, a final thanks to all in attendance today, or those watching this recording later. And I apologize in advance for my voice. I seem to have developed a cold a few days ago. So now, as someone who remembers the long and volatile debate over whether gay men and women should be allowed to serve openly in the U.S. Military, I recognized and became intrigued with a similar kind of debate that took place in Imperial Germany. Because the Kaiserreich embodied a vast set of paradoxes, it is a particularly fascinating era in German history. The paradox at the center of my book revolves around the simultaneous existence of, on the one hand, a strong authoritarian monarchy in which the military had an outsized place of privilege. And really, 19th century Prussia served as the paradigmatic example of militarism. And on the other, the world's first organized movement for queer emancipation, and an example of the period's surprisingly progressive politics. Now, scholars have typically treated these two phenomena separately, but I was interested in the ways that right from the start, modern queer identity which really begins in the 19th century, and the struggle for equal rights were deeply entwined with military personnel. Moreover, a string of interconnected scandals in the early 1900s unleashed very public and heated debates about this entanglement, debates that throughout Germany and abroad disseminated various theories of same-sex identity, as well as a variety of related sexological concepts from this period, including sadism, masochism, fetishism, and transvestism, and of course, homosexuality. Though the military leadership was ill prepared to deal with this onslaught of sexual discourse, the scandals dealt an even more devastating blow to the nascent queer emancipation movement, which was in fact blamed for the scandals. My title, Uniform Fantasies, names the objects of my study and structures my methodology. And let me start with the first term, uniforms, which were ubiquitous in German society. As W.E.B. Du Bois remarked in an 1893 essay written while he was studying in Berlin on a fellowship, quote, "It is the omnipresent soldiery of Berlin that first captures the American visitor's attention. The whole city seems to have a half-military stride. All Prussia rushes pell-mell to the window to see the ever-passing regiment. And German ideals, from king to lover, appear at first sight to be clad in spurs and shoulder strap." Of course, while Germany's policy of near universal conscription certainly contributed to the sheer number of men in uniform, the monarchy's busy calendar of military ceremonies and parades made them regular public attractions. This visibility was also strengthened by the monarchy's fear of civil unrest, which led it to station troops throughout the country, especially in cities like Berlin, which had a particularly well-organized working class. And this chart here of all the different garrisons show that an entire battalion was actually stationed in and around Berlin, and that was far from Germany's borders. Equally important for their visibility, though, was the enormous discrepancy between civilian forms of male dress, by now reduced to the color black and other muted tones, and colorful military dress. Nevertheless, despite their name, military uniforms at this time were hardly uniform, even within any one national army. And the relatively late unification of Germany under Prussian hegemony in 1871 made its military dress a particularly fragmented affair. Though Bavarian troops were allowed to retain their light blue colors, there were also extensive variations within the Prussian forces, with infantry and artillery sporting dark blue coats, and the lifeguards and light infantry clad in forest green coats. Meanwhile, the differences in attire among the four Prussian cavalry units, cuirassiers, uhlans, hussars, and dragoons, were even greater. This lithograph by Georg Kricke, which was commissioned for an official compendium, nicely illustrates this astonishing variety for both officers and enlisted men. Just this small cross-section of parade, gala, court, and winter uniforms features 4 different colors of coats, 5 different varieties of pants, 3 different kinds of boots, and 4 different kinds of headgear, not to mention the different breastplates, cuffs, epaulettes, sashes, belts, buttons, braids, trims, and other insignia. We can already begin to see how such images elicited a variety of fantasies. Indeed, the German word Fantasie, which also includes the concept of imagination, was repeatedly invoked during this period to castigate the uniform's ornamental and self-consciously visible nature, which by this time were the hallmarks of female fashion. So, for instance, here's some female fashion, a fashion plate from around this time. Especially after smokeless gunpowder made this visibility not only unnecessary, but lethal, critics inside and outside the army took aim at their impracticality and expense. Moreover, images like this one, and these types of images circulated frequently in both serious compendia and books for boys, actually mirror fashion plates like this one in women's journals. For instance, we see frontal, profile, and posterior perspectives worn by similar looking individuals, all of equal height and all sporting more or less the same facial hair and expressions. And all of this de-emphasizes the wearer in favor of the clothes. By placing the figures in various groupings that vaguely suggest some kind of meaningful activity, discussing army business or giving and taking orders, they also stoke the imagination and fantasy of viewers, spurring them, as Sharon Marcus has argued about fashion plates, to concoct stories about the images or evoke desires that are, quote, phantasmatic in the sense that they can never be fully realized, end quote. This fantasy is also a key concept for my book. There are a couple of important ways that uniformed personnel figured as queer fantasy objects. But my book also explores how these fantasies often backfired or spurred homophobic fantasies in return. So in chapter 1, I focus on the fantasy of the homosexual officer as a politically useful victim of homophobia or of homophobia for queer activism. So, for example, in his first book, Sappho and Socrates, published anonymously in 1896, Magnus Hirschfeld opens with the story of a patient. Now, Hirschfeld's an important figure because in the following year, 1897, he founded the Scientific Humanitarian Committee, which was the largest and most active advocacy group until the First World War. According to Hirschfeld, this patient, a military officer, committed suicide on the night of his wedding, though not before supposedly penning a letter to Hirschfeld in which he asked him to, quote, accept this outcry of a miserable wretch, the justification of my act, and simultaneously the salvation of honor for so many individuals who, like me, live their lives under a double curse, the curse of nature and the curse of law, end quote. Nevertheless, the desperate officer closed his letter with the wish that his suffering and death will not have been in vain. Quote, may it be possible that my voice, like those of better champions, will not fall on deaf ears. The thought that my voice could contribute to the German fatherland thinking more justly about us brightens my dying hour, end quote. Hirschfeld and others in the Scientific Humanitarian Committee certainly believed that self-sacrificing officers made valiant and sympathetic figures in a melodrama of innocent victims wronged by society. And in fact, they kept quite detailed letters, quite detailed information on officers who did commit suicide and whether that might be because of their homosexuality. And they pursued the strategy until a number of high-ranking officers from the nobility were accused of homosexuality, but opted to pursue legal action instead of committing suicide. Such was the case with General Kuno von Moltke, who was the head of the city of Berlin's military officers, after the fearsome journalist Maximilian Harden accused him of being a homosexual. Rather than taking his life, Moltke sued his accuser for libel in what became the period's most detailed airing of the private life of a top-ranking officer. As such, the sensationalistic Harden-Moltke trial, and really it's comparable to the O.J. Simpson trial in the US in the 1990s, put an end to the viability of the homosexual officer as a sympathetic victim. And because Hirschfeld served as an expert witness against Moltke, it also severely damaged the queer emancipation movement as a whole, as members left in droves and contributions dried up. If officers emerged as unreliable objects of sympathy, uniformed conscripts functioned as particularly important objects of desire, which is a second kind of queer uniform fantasy that I look at. That this desire was foundational to queer identity can be traced back to Karl Heinrich Ulrichs, who in 1862 lost his job over rumors that he was engaging in sexual relations with soldiers. The experience led him to begin theorizing about the nature of same-sex identity in the 1860s as part of his campaign, and this was largely a solo effort, to achieve political and social rights for individuals like himself. Now, in the 7th of 12 pamphlets, he offered his own experience as evidence that same-sex desire was a natural inborn trait rather than a perversion caused by masturbation, seduction, or a wanton lifestyle. As a boy of 14, Ulrichs recalled being beset by a thought just as he was about to fall asleep, writing, quote, "What if now a soldier were to climb up through the window and come to me in my room?" End quote. As he explained, his quote imagination, fantasie, always painted some splendid military specimen, 20 to 22 years old, and then it burned in me like a fire. End quote. Despite the specificity of the erotic image, Ulrichs insisted that he had, quote, never come into any kind of contact with a soldier, nor exchanged even a word with one, end quote. Moreover, though he insisted that these fantasies were not masturbatory in nature, that is, they were not directed toward any particular pleasure, its focus revolved entirely around the uniform. Indeed, in this and other examples he gives, it is the uniform, not the individual wearer or the naked body or the body that might be naked underneath, that magnetizes his erotic attention. I want to suggest, however, that the erotic fantasy was also, in effect, woven into the uniforms themselves. Much as corset-shaped women's bodies, the tightly tailored cut of the uniform forced the soldier's body into particular poses. According to the clothing historian Kersten Flimtrop, Imperial German army uniforms compelled their wearers to adopt an especially erect posture with a straight back and stretched neck to ensure that the jacket material lay flat on the body. This upright carriage was reinforced by high, stiff collars, which lay directly on the neck and obliged men to hold their heads in a rigid position, while narrow openings for the arms and shoulder seams also significantly constrained movement of the upper body. Moreover, uniforms did not just shape and display a disciplined male body, they also guided and excited the gazing eye in particular ways. While epaulets gave the impression of broad shoulders, the cut of the Imperial German jacket, which in some cases included padding, not where we expect it today, like on the top of the shoulders, but running from top to bottom inside the front, all of which directed the viewer's attention to the chest and made it seem thrust forward. And in many coats, buttons were laid in slightly diagonal rows, wider at the top than at the bottom, which further accentuated the chest while also making the waist appear narrower. Altogether, these features turned soldiers into dandies and sex objects, and it's no wonder that Ulrichs and many of his fellow homosexuals were so powerfully drawn to soldiers in uniform. In chapter 3, I explore how this uniform fetishism led to a large underground economy of male prostitution by soldiers in Berlin, Potsdam, and other German cities. Though this economy was known within the military as well as in queer male circles, it only became a public scandal after a soldier testified to its existence at the Harden-Moltke trial. Unfortunately, because the Scientific Humanitarian Committee's archives were destroyed and burned in 1933 by the Nazis, and the Prussian military archives were largely destroyed in Allied bombings in the Second World War, we have little documentary evidence from those who participated in it. Fortunately, we do have a wide variety of published texts from this period, including a debate in the Reichstag, and this is where focusing on the competing fantasies that these texts spin becomes an important methodology. For instance, after the revelations at the Harden-Moltke trial led to a number of newspaper articles, caricatures like these two, and anti-military speeches in the Reichstag, especially by August Bebel, the leader of the Social Democrats, the war minister Karl von Einem was forced to take to the floor. Quote, "Now, gentlemen, I must concede a different point to Deputy Bebel. The evil that Bebel speaks about has admittedly grown significantly in Berlin over the past decades. That's also what Hardin was referring to when, in his trial, he said that whole regiments were contaminated. There may be a large exaggeration or two in such claims, but the facts are indeed quite clear that our soldiers resist only with great effort the assaults that scoundrels from civilian circles are making against them. End quote. Though Einem makes a few concessions to his political opponents about the widespread involvement of soldiers in male prostitution, his account seeks to depict as fact that German soldiers are actually the innocent victims of homosexual advances. Now, it's easy to see the war minister's emphasis on homosexual aggression as the kind of fantasy that flew in the face of reality. Indeed, the following year, an anonymously authored book entitled Das perverse Berlin not only pointed to cases in which soldiers solicited uninterested men, including, it happens, the future Chancellor Theobald von Bethmann-Hollweg, who was walking across the Tiergarten, Berlin Central Park, and was solicited by an officer, by an enlisted man. But he reminded readers that armed soldiers who have been trained in the use of deadly force are hardly incapable of protecting themselves from inappropriate advances by other men. Nevertheless, I argue that Einem's account does accurately represent the military sense of its powerlessness to check the erotic desire that uniforms elicited in homosexuals. Moreover, the word assaults also symbolize military prostitution as an attack on Einem's own sexual innocence, which he highlighted by claiming that before these revelations, quote, I have never read anything about such things. They were foreign to me and they were disgusting, end quote. And the military's investment in sexual innocence also extended to the soldiers themselves. Thus, rather than training them how to respond to sexual advances from other men, the Army leadership took a paternalistic approach by simply limiting when and where soldiers could wear their enticing dress uniforms. But as it turns out, the soldier's sexual innocence was also the kernel of the queer male desire for men in uniform. Thus, to explain why soldiers engaged in male prostitution, the anonymous author of Das perverse Berlin offered his own fantasy scenarios, including this one in which a male prostitute enters military service in order to obtain a uniform and thereby make more money. The scenario reads, Gosh, Hans, where did you get all that money I see you with? And who bought you the fine new dress uniform? Asks one or the other soldiers who sleep in the same room as Hans. But finally, he becomes more confiding. Next time, Hans takes his curious comrade with him. And since he's a pretty boy, everyone, after all, looks nice in a uniform. Within just a short time, he has a relationship, or even more than one. End quote. Though the tight-fitting masculine military uniform is of course recognized as a key source of the soldier's desirability, this scenario underlines the soldier's sexual innocence. For the one asking the question cannot fathom how Hans acquired his newfound wealth and expensive gift uniform. Of course, the setting of the scenario, the barracks where the soldiers sleep together, is itself highly suggestive here. It is also important that the scene includes more than one soldier, and it imagines how sharing the secrets seems to strengthen their heterosexual bonds of camaraderie. But what is also important in this scenario is that the soldiers are motivated by a desire for money rather than a desire for sex, or certainly sex with a man. My reading of this and other scenarios from the book suggests that homosexual civilians who chase after sex with uniformed soldiers shared the military's leadership's fantasy of the soldier's heterosexual innocence. That is, in seeking to have sex with a straight man in uniform, who is only motivated by money, these men are chasing after access to an impossible libidinal economy that is blocked by their own awareness of their desires. That is, gay men's or homosexual men's awareness of their desires. And I call this fantasy a kind of barracks of Eden because of the way the fantasy mirrors Adam and Eve's own sex in the Garden of Eden before they ate from the tree of knowledge. Of course, this shared fantasy makes this transgression all the more unpalatable to the German public, for it indexed the public's sense that homosexuals were defiling and stealing, even as they bought, the source of their pleasure, the soldier's sexual innocence. And because soldiers were understood to be innocent, the only response was to blame the homosexuals. Of course, some men with same-sex desires did not necessarily want to have sex with the soldier as much as they wanted to be one. Thus, the last fantasy I want to talk to you about today is the one that makes up the fourth chapter, Thomas Mann's lifelong fantasy of himself as a soldier. Now, Thomas Mann was a leading author of the period and went on to win the Nobel Prize in 1929, Nobel Prize for Literature in 1929. And this fantasy begins in 1900 when he is conscripted into the army and tries to serve as a one-year volunteer, which is a much shorter time frame, and it was only open to those with the requisite level of education and the money to support themselves for 1 year, and that included purchasing their equipment as well as their own uniforms. My discussion in this chapter focuses on how the possibility of wearing the uniform and the masculinity it promises figures into Mann's attempt to woo Paul Ehrenberg, whom he later called the central affair of my heart. However, because Mann only lasted 3 months in the military before obtaining a medical discharge for a slight foot injury, the rest of the chapter focuses on his efforts to kind of put a positive spin on his failure as a soldier, as well as his efforts to stylize himself as a soldier out of uniform. This effort it's visible in a lot of his works, but it's most visible in the military recruitment chapter in Felix Kroll, which is a first-person novel about the escapades of his titular hero who makes his living as a hotel bellhop and con man. Central to Kroll's strategy of conning others is this theorization of fantasy's power to alter the perception of reality. Indeed, the novel celebrates fictional storytelling as the pleasurable apex of this power. As Kroll exclaims to his intended readers early on, quote, "What a glorious gift imagination is," so Fantasie, and what satisfaction it affords, end quote. Now, even though the novel was first published in 1954, Mann had written the military recruitment scene between 1911 and 1913 and had given public readings of it as well. It's also worth pointing out that Mann subsequently referred to Felix Kroll as his homosexual novel, and I read this chapter as Mann's deployment of homosexual camp. Indeed, with Kroll's penchant for ironic self-presentation, elaborately staged ruses, relentlessly stylized language, rich with linguistic precision, and self-consciously even fussy complexity, the novel bears the marks of Queer Camp's love of exaggeration and mimicry. In this scene, Kroll exaggeratedly pretends to be eager to enter the military service, which already makes him suspect, and then proceeds to bestow increasingly exalted titles on the medical officer, the lowly medical officer, raising the latter's suspicion. As the doctor tells him, quote, "Your manner of speech is marked by a distinct lack of restraint, which frankly struck me some time ago. What is actually the matter with you?" End quote. Though the doctor thinks he is leading the investigation, Kroll's speech lays the trap, which he then springs by simulating an epileptic fit that convinces the doctor to discharge him on the spot. The mastery that Kroll exerts linguistically, as well as over his own body, seems to illustrate Philip Core's playful quip that, quote, "Camp is essential to military discipline," end quote. The protagonist's success in evading his military obligations seems to suggest that Mann had completely reversed his stance on the army in favor of the freedom of imagination provided by the civilian life of the writer. But as Mann claimed in a 1918 letter to Paul Amann, quote, "At bottom, Kroll is a militarist, like all my heroes," end quote. Thus, when Kroll returns triumphantly to the dressing room, the non-commissioned officer on duty tells him, quote, "It's a shame for you, Kroll, or whatever your name is. You're a proper fellow. You would have amounted to something in the army. You have what it takes at first sight. You would have certainly made a fine soldier. Who knows if you mightn't have made sergeant major if you had signed on after your required military service," end quote. His words lead Kroll to briefly imagine, much like Mann before him, quote, "how splendidly, naturally, and convincingly the military uniform would have become me. What a satisfying effect my figure would have made in it for however long I would have worn it," end quote. But he also admits that it would have been a foolish misconception if I had therefore believed I should have lived as a soldier. Thus, he concludes in favor of an entirely literary conceit. Quote, "It may be said that to live like a soldier, but not as a soldier, figuratively, but not literally, to be allowed to live allegorically, spells true freedom," end quote. The implication is that Mann, as the author of Felix Kroll and now a renowned writer, no longer needed to don a uniform or endure the physical hardship of drill to become a masculine soldier of sorts. But I want to point out that this insular and solipsistic form of German militarism, what I call Mann's own private militarism, was not the internalization of a top-down ideology, but rather a response to his sense of his own inadequacy as a man who was fundamentally attracted to other male individuals. When actual military service failed to cure him of his homosexuality and effeminacy, and when he failed at being a soldier, he merely transferred his military fantasy to writing and art. Yet whatever ironic distance Mann professed from actual military service, the outbreak of war in 1914 revealed this inner distance to be a ruse, as I show through an analysis of his wartime essays, in which he ruthlessly embraced Germany's most belligerent qualities while narcissistically stylizing himself as a heroic soldier fighting the war from his desk. One of the few, however, to see through Thomas Mann's fantasies and self-deceptions was his older brother Heinrich, also a writer. As Heinrich wrote to him in 1917, following their break over the elder brother's opposition to the conflict, quote, "If your extreme position in the war has astonished you, for me it was foreseeable." And in the final chapter of my book, I turn to the penetrating and ruthless critique that Heinrich Mann offers in his most famous novel, The Loyal Subject, Der Untertan, which he completed just before the First World War. And it was serialized starting on January 1st, and that serialization was actually interrupted by the war because his novel was such a critique of the emperor and others. And this book cover here features a still from the 1951 DEFA film, and you can see these what are called dueling scars on his cheek and right above the ear. And I'm going to talk about that in a second. Bond's novel offers a brilliantly savage satire of bourgeois adulation for Kaiser Wilhelm II, pictured here as he wished to be seen. And after it was published in book form in 1918, and it was a huge success, bestseller, The Loyal Subject became the period's most influential and enduring left liberal critique of German militarism and the citizenry's anticipatory obedience. And just for that reason alone, it seems particularly topical for US readers today. Yet rather than depicting fantasy or imagination as a source of artistic freedom, as Thomas Mann's Kroll does, The Loyal Subject depicts fantasy as a pathological disavowal of reality. Moreover, not only does the novel use Thomas Mann's failed military enlistment for its anti-hero, and Thomas Mann actually wrote out his enlistment scene for Heinrich Mann to use in this novel. But it also extends the pathological forms of effeminacy from homosexuality to masochism and transvestism, suggesting that these conditions are the cause of its anti-hero's illiberalism and his failure to achieve the period's bourgeois ideal of the autonomous male subject. So, for example, while wearing the official uniform of his university dueling fraternity, the anti-hero Dietrich Hessling muses via an interior monologue about the pleasure he takes in the uniform. And I'm not going to read the quote just to save some time here. His thoughts, however, reveal a couple of important contradictions between this masculine garb and his underlying physical and psychological effeminacy. So first, rather than a sign of masculinity, his paunch links him more closely to the soft female body by the lazy way it was procured through drinking beer with his fellow fraternity members instead of studying, further connects Hessling's body back to his mother, who pilfered food between meals and who shirked her work responsibilities to gossip with the servant. Second, because the uniform does not so much express his fearless masculinity as protect him from the dangers of other men, including the fear of being yelled at by a lowly uniformed municipal employee. It also falls short of the honorable masculinity he imagines he portrays, for the uniform is merely a prop for managing his unmasculine fear. Finally, his masquerade even extends to the dueling scar on his face, the result of the sword duel, mensur, that served as an initiation ritual in the fraternity. Though Hessling certainly imagines a scar as an inscription of the masculine uniform on his body, in the passage here it connotes mere surface, since its function is purely for display. It is a costume that, like all the rest, really a part of his drag impersonation of masculinity. So these techniques for managing his shameful effeminacy, however, no longer help when Hessling enters the army. Not only does the recruitment doctor give his belly a mocking look, and that provokes both laughter from the assembly of fellow recruits and leads Hessling to turn bright red in embarrassment, but the actual military uniform becomes a source of torture. Thus, in contrast to the fraternity uniform, the authentic military uniform becomes, quote, an instrument of martyrdom, such that the objective enthusiasm which Dietrich was prepared to feel had to retreat behind his personal distress, end quote. Thus, instead of facilitating an empty performance of masculinity, the kind of performance that he sees the captain providing, or a performance that Hessling imagines could reconfigure his fat and feminized body as masculine, the real military uniform only fits actual trained masculine bodies. So despite the brilliance of this critique, and it's really a fun novel to read, I want to point out some problems in problems in the novel's use of fantasy. First, there are the ethical problems that inhere in a narrative technique that satirizes Hessling through revealing his innermost fantasies. Though providing these interior monologues illuminates his motivations, it disavows an awareness that nobody's public image or self-esteem would likely survive the persistent revelation of their private fantasies. If, as Freud claims, men's fantasies always revolve around ambition when they don't revolve around sex, it seems far more likely that readers share more similarities with the protagonist than we would care to admit. Moreover, this strategy of shaming Hessling for his lack of masculinity aligns the novel with the bourgeoisie's severe and punitive forms of policing gender and sexual identity, which in turn is why the army in its uniform promised a kind of masculine sanctuary to individuals like Thomas Mann. So let me close by briefly mentioning where my book concludes, which is tracing the impact of the First World War on these uniform fantasies. To be sure, the seriousness of war in 1914 swept away colorful military uniforms, which were replaced by practical field gray ones. And to illustrate what this means for queer male desire, I draw on the letters and paintings of the American artist Marston Hartley, who moved to Berlin in 1913, in part because he was attracted to a Prussian military officer he had met in Paris. So, for instance, his first painting, The Warriors, from 1913, celebrates the colorful military uniforms and pageantry of pre-war Berlin. But after his officer friend fell in the early days of the war, he began painting somber homages to his dead friend, such as his famous portrait of a German officer, one of many abstract paintings of the dismembered colorful dress uniform surrounded in black. And with many queer individuals conscripted to the front, the experience of war also significantly altered queer politics in the post-war era. And though my book ends essentially with 1914, 1915, I'm happy to talk during the Q&A about some of the excellent work that others have done on queer militarism and the Weimar Republic or National Socialism. So thank you for listening.
Thanks so much, Jeffrey. It was exciting to re-experience the book through your presentation. I'd like to thank Chad and Sky for hosting this wonderful event and for their dedication to the series. It's been a great pleasure to learn more about your work, but also the work of the two programs with which you're affiliated at your respective institutions. It's so exciting to see so much activity, in particular in the realm of German studies. And of course, I have an abiding interest in queer German studies. I'm especially excited by the archive of former talks in the series. I know you already pointed to them, but I wanted to tell those in the audience, if you haven't had the chance to do so, do check out the YouTube channel. I've learned quite a lot from it, and I promise you it's worth your time. It's a great honor to speak at today's event. I've been an admirer of Jeffrey Schneider's work since my grad school days. And since then, I've followed the scholarship that would result in this remarkable book. I double checked with Jeffrey right beforehand, but if this was in fact true, and I'm glad it was, because I remember specifically meeting you as a grad student, you presented portions of this research or some version of it that ended up being published elsewhere at Washington University in St. Louis some time ago. I was a graduate student there at the time and was grateful to learn about exciting work in queer German studies in my first years anticipating my own dissertation on Wilhelmine cultural studies. And thinking back on this, I have to say it was such a treat, especially in the conservative institutional constellation that is German studies. And I'll be glad to say more about German studies conservatisms at a later point. But I've since my graduate school days had the pleasure to hear you talk in different contexts and read your work, and on more than one occasion also with my students. So before I move on with my official commentary, I wanted to take this moment to thank you personally for your scholarship, which continues to mean quite a lot to me and scholars like me throughout the field. And now back to business. One aspect about Jeffrey's scholarship that initially drew my attention, next to the obvious ones like sexuality studies and Wilhelmine perversions, is how he attends to disciplinary and methodological situatedness. And it'll take me just one moment to explicate this. I'll begin by noting that I was intellectually raised in what I sometimes jokingly refer to as pure literary and pure film studies. This means that I maintain a strong commitment to the study of cultural production. In my world, literature, film, theater, the arts generally, and art practices of various forms hold much information about how to think and feel through challenging situations. They hold information about the time in which these works were produced, and their longer reception histories can tell us a lot about how people related to the world around them. Studying the logics of particular queer cultural texts holds much information for intellectual histories of queer life worlds, which often yield information about the joys and pleasures and pain and injury that attend queer life across history. In other words, studying cultural production is a particularly potent site for the study of sexuality. Us queers have long felt a strong draw to the realm of the aesthetic, to performance, and to fantasy. And it is then unsurprising that literary histories, film histories, theater histories, and art histories are impossible to envision without queer people. By extension, there is no history of sexuality without the history of art. Scholars in literary studies, for instance, then have a lot to contribute to ongoing discussions in queer studies and in the so-called history of sexuality. While the realm of queer German studies holds quite a lot of space for the humanities and social sciences at once, in more recent history, the realm of social sciences has seen a proliferation of scholarship in queer German studies. Here, my historian comrades in particular are kicking butt, as the kids would say. And I love them. I love their work, and I'm very grateful for their dedication to the field. In fact, my own scholarship, when I pursue it, I cite them, I engage with their ideas, I praise them, I draw on them, I let them inspire some of my own thinking. My advocacy work, I help them land gigs, host events celebrating their work, and more. To me, good queer literary studies, for instance, necessitates engaging with queer historiography broadly speaking. However, it does not appear that the flip side of that dynamic works in the same way. Meaning, social scientists might not even notice a talk, an article, a book on queer literary studies, let alone find it important enough to engage with. To me, this is a great opportunity for our social sciences comrades to express their solidarity with scholars working in queer literary studies. And I'd like to challenge my historian comrades working in queer German studies to engage more with scholarship in queer literary, queer film, and queer cultural studies. If you, as a historian, work on visual culture or discursive history, including that of aesthetic movements, you might not need to reinvent the wheel, as it were, but might benefit from engaging with admirable scholarship by your comrades, which we've been producing for decades. You might like to start with Jeffrey's book, in fact. It indeed, among many other great qualities, makes a case for literature as an important site at which to access some information important for the history of sexuality. It is an admirable study that ought to resonate with many of the ongoing discussions in queer German studies broadly, especially those of you who work in a realm of queer German historiography that deals with material related to Wilhelmine Germany will find a lot of points of engagement in Uniform Fantasies. In pursuing a material and cultural history of the uniform in the Wilhelmine era, one decidedly grounded in queer studies, the book indeed models how to link literary studies and historiography in generative ways. It in fact shows how the former, meaning literary studies, has quite lots to offer for the latter, and here I mean historiography generally. The analytic category of fantasy is quite potent in this regard. Jeffrey showcases how the work of the famed sexologist Magnus Hirschfeld, and we just heard a bit about this in the presentation. He goes in great detail with this, with regard to this in the book. So Magnus Hirschfeld, whose work is associated with scientific reason and humanist advocacy in the longer Enlightenment tradition, could benefit from an analysis grounded in a theory of melodrama in order to study how the affective excesses framed the way his public persona was perceived in the public and among his collaborators in the Wissenschaftlich-Humanitäres Komitee, the Scientific Humanitarian Committee that Jeffrey mentioned. Jeffrey situates his discussion of Hirschfeld in a context of the Harden-Moltke trial, which provides an opportunity to showcase how journalistic practice, often pursued by literary and stage writers, turned to the popular mode of the melodrama by which to prime the fantasies of readers towards certain aims. Fantasy here is not a private matter, though it might often take place in private, but rather comes to be a tool for a major public trial that informed much of queer organizing around 1900. As Jeffrey notes, Hirschfeld's participation in a trial significantly weakened the work of the Wissenschaftlich-Humanitäres Komitee, which increasingly sought distance from popular genres and modes of engagement, precisely because Hirschfeld could not control how the story of the trial proliferated through the public. Fantasy, as potent means to engage a public through melodrama, was then also a dangerous because uncontrollable form of engagement. As the cultural theorist Lauren Berlant notes, fantasy, just like desire, might find expression in institutionalized genres such as the melodrama, but it remains challenging to control how fantasy in its public manifestations actually resonates with individuals. To stimulate fantasy might form a bridge to some form of pleasure, but it could also backfire, as it did for Hirschfeld, who sought to position himself in a public spectacle of the trial as he did. I'd be remiss to not participate or pursue a short tangent, just one quick aside on the matter of the Wissenschaftlich-Humanitäres Komitee and then the matter of melodrama. The committee would resent melodrama for the rest of its history. When Richard Oswald, the famous Wilhelmine and Weimar era film director, approached the Wissenschaftlich-Humanitäres Komitee to pitch a queer melodrama in 1918, the committee was very strongly against it, and there was quite a lot of infighting about it. And Hirschfeld was one of the major proponents of melodrama, who eventually persuaded the committee to back a project that resulted in the 1919 queer film melodrama Anders als die anderen, which became a major sensation in the earlier years of Weimar Germany and was an important component of the queer rights organizing Hirschfeld undertook in the first years of the Republic. Jeffrey's discussion of Karl Heinrich Ulrich's soldier fantasies are quite striking for me. I was very excited to read more about Ulrich's, whom I always thought deserved much more attention than he's already gotten. Actually, I think his broader work is incredible, and it's super intriguing for some of our ongoing discourses in queer studies. I was very excited to see him also mentioned in his book. The early homosexual rights advocate is most known for his queer rights pamphleteering, which invariably informed the work of Hirschfeld and the Wissenschaftlich-Humanitäres Komitee, despite some of the differences which Jeffrey admirably outlines in the book. And most recently, there's been a lot of exciting scholarly interest in Ulrich as a cultural figure and queer activist alike. As I was reading your opening remarks in the introduction to the book and then the discussion of uniform fetishism in chapter 3, which starts with a discussion of Ulrich's perversion of the uniform for sexual gratification. And with perversion, I mean using an object for a purpose for which it was not intended. I was astonished by the generosity of your writing. In calling attention to the uniform and also positioning it as an important feature of queer writing at the time, your work inspired me to think about the uniform as a literary phenomenon too. I mean, you do that work, of course, in your analysis of demands, but I feel like there is potentially an interest in a broader history of queer literature with a specific focus on the uniform. And here I thought Ulrich's would be an exciting case study, and that is beyond the texts for which you already admirably study in your book. And for instance, I wanted to mention Ulrich wrote a series of short stories published in a collection titled Matrosengeschichten, which was published in 1885, where the figure of the soldier, but also uniformed life generally in a form of sailors, professionals, and also mythological figures in various soldierly garbs, play similar roles of facilitating same-sex desire as the uniform plays in some of your analyses. The most famous of Ulrich's short stories from this collection is Manor, one of the early explicitly queer vampire stories. Some of you might be familiar with the short story. If you're not, consider checking it out. It's wild and intriguing and complicated and demands much more readership than it's gotten so far. But in another story titled Sulitelma, which details a fantasy of a young man finding his way to a supernatural ship of sailors run like a navy ship, the protagonist expresses fetishistic desire around a quality of life of sailors as particularly manly domain to which he, as a kind of self-professed sissy, finds himself drawn. And so the public staging of the body through a professional viewed to be manly serves as an invitation for fantasy, for desire, and for lust. And this is all facilitated through the act of reading and some of the staging of this kind of effeminate male figure interacting with this manly domain of the ship. To think about the longer history of queer desire and uniformed life, this time with special connection to the Prussian military, I had to think about the extensive queer longing in Heinrich von Kleist's letters to his love interest, Ernst von Pfuhl. Both had a history with the Prussian military, in particular at the time of the Napoleonic Wars, and indeed viewed their military connection as a means by which to stay in contact with one another under the banner of camaraderie, where the uniform served as a sort of shield behind which to conceal their desire to one another or refract it through sanctioned forms of male bonding. Kleist, of course, crumbled under the weight of the world and succumbed to a desperate situation early on in his life. Much of the burdens he felt on his person and his mind were because of the military and the violence to which he felt he was subjected under the banner of discipline. Of note is the tension between the possibility for queer union and the burdens to queer life that the uniform signaled to him at once. And I felt like this too kind of speaks well to some of the ideas that you tried to rehearse, or that you rehearse in your book with regard to the sort of multiple affordances of the uniform vis-a-vis queer expressivity, queer desire, and queer life worlds. Another figure in the queer literary history of the uniform most certainly has to be I'm very selfish here, a person who I'm writing about right now, August von Platen. By the time he died in 1835, he had amassed a large archive of writings, some of which still requires more queer studies approaches to access, which is my invitation to you all and to the audience. Please engage more with these texts. There's quite a lot more to be done and to be said about them. And one of the most promising areas of interest to those hoping to study Platen's queer writings are, in fact, Platen's diaries. These were kept sealed by the publishing house Cotta, which issued one portion of them for the occasion of Platen's 100th birthday in 1896, and a second volume of them followed shortly thereafter in 1900. The publication became a literary sensation, for the famed German poet revealed in them his innermost desires, including detailed accounts of his queer longing, in particular during social engagements and calls for duty as member of the Bavarian army. Queer intelligentsia came to be obsessed with Platen's diaries, which helped enshrine Platen as a major figure for queer cultural history from the vantage point of queer writing around 1900, including many features in Hirschfeld's publications, mentions by members of the Wissenschaftlich-Humanitäres Komitee in their publications, etc. The queer French writer Marc-André Rafolovitch published a book titled Uranism and Unisexuality, a study of different manifestations of the sexual instinct. So a French book published in 1896, so this just months after the diaries came out, and dedicated an entire chapter to Platen, which he titled August von Platen, or the Superior Uranist. Edward Prime-Stevenson, whom you cite in your book, Jeffrey, self-published an important study titled The Intersexes, A History of Semisexualism as a Problem in Social Life, which came out in 1910, which was intended to survey all the accomplishments in sexology and queer rights organizing in German-speaking Europe. And he hoped to make those available to American audiences. A huge, and I think the largest chapter of the book, and it's also the last chapter of the book, is a biography of Platen. Like Rafolovitch, Prime-Stevenson focuses on admirable qualities of Platen's and hones in on the honest depiction of his obsession with soldiers in uniform that he rehearsed in his diaries. Platon confesses that he learned about queer sexuality precisely through what he initially thought were inexplicable urges for masculinist strength embodied in uniformed soldiers, where his very look at a uniform, and here he describes in great detail, just a gaze that he casts at the uniform, produced an occasion that negated his own body by recasting it as inadequate without being embraced by a uniformed man. So for Platon, a configuration of himself as a self-understanding of himself as a queer subject only can take place through this physical embrace within a uniformed soldier. And Platon came to embrace that he might not be right for the uniform, in fact, meaning he himself was not right for the uniform, because he was more drawn to philosophy and poetry. Prime-Stevenson, by writing about his understanding of Platon's writings, which in my view is trying to make this case right now, the type of like engagement of Prime-Stevenson patterns through his reading of Platon's diaries, in my view, is a version of proto-queer German studies. And it tries to extrapolate from within these diaries, with a special focus on the uniform, an image of idealized homosexuality around 1900, which finds expression via a distance to, but desire for, the masculine ideals captured by military masculinity. And if Prime-Stevenson finds so much import in a uniform, and if his writings truly do form proto-queer German studies scholarship, which I believe they do, then they certainly would welcome an approach such as the one that you are modeling your uniform fantasies to frame them. And here I'm just trying to articulate how generative your model has been in my own sort of like rethinking of some of these figures vis-a-vis their relationship to the uniform. And by way of anticipating the closing of my remarks, I wanted to bring up a last example, one that reaches, so far I've traced a couple of examples before the sort of time period to which you are beholden. I wanted to bring up one last example, one that reaches beyond the period demarcation of your study. And that is Bruno Vogel's 1929 pacifist and socialist syndicalist novel, Alf. Usually cast as the queer and working class version of Erich Maria Remarque's Im Westen nichts Neues, the novel details a militarist obsession in Wilhelmine Germany alongside a queer coming-of-age story where military sociability, as is the case in your account, both facilitates and destroys queer unions. The uniform was a tool for disidentificatory practice for the characters, by which queer men could relate to the world. Here I draw on the work of one of my favorite queer theorists, Jose Esteban Munoz, whose theorization of disidentification helps contextualize often unsavory practices queer people turn to in order to make it from one day to the next. In this regard, the literary history of queer uniforms might indeed be a literary history of disidentification, for the toxic and fraught context of militarist life was always an articulation of an anti-queer social practice queers tried to make work for them. It is unsurprising, then, that beyond momentary survival, militaristic orders could not facilitate anything more for queer people. And in fact, they very frequently failed them. For it was only through this disidentificatory and very sort of like discomforting practice and incomplete practice that left queers often yearning for better contexts, that we can kind of see some of the toxicity of the militaristic orders as such. And finally, just a brief remark that in this moment, queer people, as you all know, especially our trans comrades, as is the case for other people demonized by the police state, are facing a crisis, like one crisis after another in real time, living in the US, but also beyond. And in this context, the state, and the military infrastructure to which it is beholden, discipline queer bodies, seek to eradicate queer knowledge, and obstruct it from proliferating. If ever there was an important time for queer scholarship to pursue it, to support it, to teach it, then I think it is now. And in this spirit, I'm so very grateful for Jeffrey's work, which will inspire extensive engagement, not only here, but also in other venues by way of supporting this project that we call Queer Studies, which is always connected to queer lives. And thank you so much for your attention, and thanks for having me.
Thank you for that amazing comment. It gives us so many places to have a conversation. And I'll let Jeffrey, if you'd want to comment before I dive into questions, or should I start right
Yeah,
off your comment?
I'll just say, yeah, thank you so much. I mean, of course, Platon was Thomas Mann's favorite poet. Um, and yeah, thanks for bringing up Prime-Stevenson, whose work I actually became familiar with only because you gave a presentation on a panel about his work. Yeah. So I went back and looked at both the intersexes and Imre, and I did have a section on Imre in this, actually in the third chapter, and it just the chapter is just getting too long. So I do hope I will go back to it in a different way, because it's very much about it's a good novel about the kind of fetishization of the uniform, and it's also a remarkable novel because it actually has a happy ending. So very unusual for queer novels at that time. So yeah, so thank you so much.
So in the realm of novels, one of the questions I could dive in with here is where you've spoken quite a bit about the literary influences of this history or the literary sources of this history, and what would you recommend people look for in their own attempt to look for some of these novels, or what they could be reading to put themselves in this sort of era?
That's good. I mean, uh, I actually really like Thomas Mann's short stories, where I think, because I mean, his prose is really interesting and compelling, but he wrote really long novels. But his short stories are really fantastic, and some of them are really quite queer. So that might be one way to go. I'm also a big fan of Fontana. He's my and I wrote about Effie Briest actually a couple of times now. Um, so that might be uh, a way to go, and those have been translated into English. I mean, I'm a big fan of, despite my critique, a big fan of Heinrich Mann's um, Untertan, um, yeah, loyal subject. And really just the first two chapters um, are themselves great. It's a very sophisticated work. It's his best work, I think. So, um, but then I think the other works that Avin are talking about are also really worth looking at. And I didn't think about Platon's diaries. That makes a lot of sense. So
So before I pivot to another question, because it came up, I'm going to take the liberty of showing one of my favorite little shelf
oh,
finds, a Yiddish translation of
oh,
All Quiet on the Western Front that
oh yeah.
came into my possession while I was
Wow.
graduate school at UW-Madison. But our next question is, can you recommend any painters I should look up if interested in Marsden Hartley's story?
Yeah, so like other painters, I believe he was really good friends with Charles Demuth. I don't know if it's a German pronunciation. I don't know if it goes Demuth. who was another American modernist who painted a lot of really homoerotic and queer images. And I think the two of them hung out together after Marston Hartley finally returned to the U.S. When the U.S. was about to declare war on Germany. So uh, so he would be a good one to look at as well.
I've got a couple of questions now in the uniform line directly. So I would go the first from one of our attendees. How would you, how do you, how does the phenomenon of the uniform cut or the uniform as a sexual fantasy or fetish among gay men move beyond Germany?
Yeah, I mean it's so I should say that what I'm talking about was also a very big European phenomenon. So uh queer men were some of the first sex tourists that we know of, and they would travel to Stockholm and London and Rome and other places simply to chase after men in uniform. And I think part of, the issue is that um, soldiers were always notoriously underpaid and barely had their, you know, I mean, often they, at least in the German army, they relied on coming from the countryside and having their families send care packages to them all the time. They were often very hungry, and they couldn't afford to take out uh, girls and women. So this is a way that they made money, and that's true of all these armies as well. Also in the Habsburg Empire, Budapest was another big place. Um, so, uh, so I think that definitely took place outside of Germany, and I think you know in the U.S. today there's a big group of that calls themselves military chasers who you know are particularly interested in having sex with um, uh, and I draw on some of their writings to help theorize this period of time. So Stephen Zeeland has written quite a bit about this, um, and um, yeah, is interested in the fantasy that even though they're having sex with other men, and I don't think they're, you know, necessarily it's prostitution, um uh but it's the fantasy that these are straight men who are just willing to have sex with another man, but aren't actually desiring it.
So if the last question took us beyond the borders of Germany, this one is going to take us chronologically beyond the borders of the Second Empire. So, what uniform fantasy continuities or ruptures uh, might you see between the Imperial Army and um, the Waffen SS or the Wehrmacht in uniforms and literature or visual culture?
Yeah, that's I guess I would go back and begin by thinking about the war experience in the First World War, and a couple of great people, including uh, Laurie Marhoefer, have written about this. So certainly being in the trenches and finding camaraderie, even with straight um, male soldiers who, it was absolutely horrific conditions of warfare, and they uh, also responded to kind of more nurturing or more intense male bonds, including with queer soldiers. And a lot of queer men could actually be quite open in the war. But I think those men who were in uniform came back feeling like, look, I, had fought for the fatherland, and I expect to be treated as a whole citizen. So in some sense, it kind of militarized queer politics after the war, and I think that's something that Hirschfeld didn't quite understand. And um, but then it also, gave rise to people like Ernst Röhm and others in the SA who really responded to this kind of male society and the erotics of it, and also thought and were willing to do quite horrible things on behalf of National Socialism, even as they became very quickly its victims in the Night of the Long Knives. So you definitely have a kind of Männerbund, but in the SS, which was a real bourgeois group, as opposed to the SA, which was really more working class. Himmler was a notorious homophobe, um, and there were often quite punitive measures if you were caught having uh, same-sex behavior in the SS. So, but there have been other people who've written about ways that men got out of it, because of course in queer theory it's pointed to this issue is that there's competing theories, right? That in the SS, if you could kind of say, I wasn't born this way, but I was just desperate, then you could actually maybe get assigned to the front in order to show that you could really be manly. So, because you weren't born that way. So lots of contradictory ideas there.
Okay. I think one last question. I thank everybody for their time who's
Yeah.
stayed in our webinar to this point. So, what role does the uniform play in setting up the antitypes that George Mosse discusses? Those portrayed as non-German, including homosexuals or Jews. In other words, uh, did these stereotypes have to be out of uniform?
I'm not so sure. I have to think about that because, what you also have in Prussia in particular is particularly among the aristocracy, a sense that they based on their class background, were expected to be in the military, even if they had no interest in the military and were not really officers. So, and I think Moltke is a good example of that, a very effeminate general who, Hardin alleged wore makeup uh, um, and played the piano and basically got his position because he was friends with Kaiser Wilhelm, and Kaiser Wilhelm liked his sentimental piano playing. Um, so I think up until the First World War was a little bit more ambiguous, but certainly people were theorizing that, you know, and I would say, and I think in my book I say, what really happens is that the uniform gets tightened, so it actually does only fit, masculine bodies. And I think what happens in World War One is some, queer men who are actually wearing the uniform and fighting on the front realize like, hey, I've got one of those bodies. And so one of the big, and I think Laurie Marhofer um, talks about that very well in her book, Sex in the Weimar Republic, is that the real victims are effeminate gay men in the gay rights movement after during the Weimar Republic, because so there's that consistency there, is that they're always the effeminate ones. And yeah, Ulrichs also sets us up with his idea that um that gay men are naturally effeminate and hence drawn to masculine men, and that being men in uniform.
That's interesting. I was thinking of a conversation I once had about British propaganda from World War II.
Oh, uh-huh.
We were talking there because it was been pointed out that civilians depicted in propaganda, civilian men,
Mm,
quite large and well built, but
uh,
the soldier in propaganda could be an everyman.
oh,
Of the uniform, one had to be portrayed in a certain much more masculine, overtly masculine sort of way.
Interesting.
Yeah. But anyways, I will thank you both for your time and sharing your scholarship. And I just want to throw in my agreement with what Erwin said about doing queer scholarship at this moment, and very much is part of why this series picks books in this vein so often, and it's something we want to keep doing all the time. So thank you, Jeffrey, for sharing your book with us, and Erwin for sharing your thoughts, and our attendees, and those who will watch it in the future on YouTube. They always have a bigger life on YouTube after their first run. So
I've certainly watched a few of them. So
excellent.
thank you so much. I really
Thank
appreciate
you.